My name is Justin Kempf, and I host Democracy Paradox, a podcast that pushes the boundaries of our assumptions about democracy. This November, I explore the global ascendance of China over 3 parts called Liberalism, Capitalism, Communism. It kicks off with my interview with G. John Ikenberry. Go to democracyparadox.com or look for Democracy Paradox wherever you listen to podcasts.
From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State, I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. We are on Thanksgiving break this week, but I'm excited to bring you a conversation I had recently with Dr. Dawn Carpenter, host of a brand new podcast called What Does It Profit? Dawn uses her experience as an investment banker turned ethicist to explore the role that capitalism plays in our society. This is, of course, a big existential question in democracy, too, and I really appreciate Dawn's perspective as someone who's been part of the business world. In this conversation, we talk about campaign finance, corporate responsibility, and how a new generation of investors and entrepreneurs is trying to marry purpose with profits. If you enjoy what you hear in this interview, you can learn more about Dawn's podcast at whatdoesitprofitpodcast.com or by searching for What Does It Profit wherever you are listening to this episode right now. Here is my conversation with Dawn Carpenter. Dawn Carpenter, welcome to Democracy Works. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Jenna, it's my pleasure. It's nice to be on the other side of the microphone.
Indeed. So your podcast, What Does It Profit, really looks at the role that capitalism plays in our society. And I know it's something you've been thinking about for a long time and kind of come to through a somewhat unique path in your business and your educational experience. So before we dive into some of these higher level questions, can you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in some of these big picture questions?
Well, I'm almost not sure where to start. I started out life as the daughter of a bar owner and wanting to escape a career in the beverage area because I was just really lousy at that kind of stuff. I was the first in my family to go off to college. And so that kind of set me out on a pace, but I thought I'd go into the world as a political journalist. I saw all the president's men and thought I'd come to Washington and learn how to expose bad politicians. But when I got here, I realized that my very expensive education was going to be hard to pay off on a journalist's salary. So I went into investment banking, thinking that I could tell stories in a different way. And so I had a nearly 25-year investment banking career providing access to capital for social purpose organizations. And that's probably not such a novel thing nowadays, but when I was doing it in the early 90s, it was really hard to get traders excited about selling long-term bonds for organizations that called themselves nonprofit. They assumed nonprofit meant not profitable. And so it was a big sell, but we came in with some really big household names, which got the market very comfortable. And so that began a career doing that work. But I got to a place almost 25 years later where I'm like, what am I doing with my life? And I love being a banker. And it wasn't about like escaping a terrible career. It was more about, is this the purpose that I'm meant to play? And I just had this moment. I'm like, no, it's not it. Well, during the last few years of my banking career, I'd been studying the intersection of theology and business. I'm a quintessential learner. And I'm like, I'm going to go study this at a doctoral level. And so I left it all, went to Georgetown University, got a doctorate studying this concept called contributive justice theory. And that's what got me going. And in my relationships with the university, I became a fellow at a center that studies labor and the working poor. And they gave me some resources and said, do whatever you want. And so we started a podcast, and here we are.
It's really interesting to hear you say that you had intentions to be a political journalist and very much kind of wanted to speak truth to power, hold people in power accountable, and we think about investment banking, that's often, I think, portrayed in our culture as the exact opposite of that. You are the powerful, right? You are, it's the swamp, it's all of that. And I guess, I mean, did it feel that way when you were inside of it, or were you kind of cognizant of that dichotomy between people who are in power and those who are seeking to hold those in power accountable for what they're doing?
That's a really interesting kind of soul-searching kind of question. I mean, as I mentioned, I got started in my career in the early '90s, and it was clearly before the Me Too movement, but there were a lot of Me Too moments in my career. So, it's the idea of kind of being in a place ostensibly of power because you control financial resources, but feeling not in a position of power, if that makes any sense, was kind of a equalizing dynamic. But I loved my clients. My clients all had social purposes. They were museums, trade and professional associations. They were charities. I mean, the likes of everyone from beginning of the alphabet, AARP. Those types of organizations to American Geophysical Union. These are the scientists. All people whose purposes ostensibly were trying to focus on some type of common good. So I felt like it wasn't the same kind of career that your typical banker has, where you're just, it's capitalism at its purest. And I am a capitalist, so I'm not going to sit here and rail against capitalism, but there are those that, will do anything in business. And I think times are changing a little bit, but human nature is what it is. So, I never really felt like I was exploiting anyone until I started thinking about some of the more political organizations that I was doing business with or seeking to do business with. And now I look back after, number of years kind of intellectually soul searching, look back and I'm like, wow, what was I perpetuating?
That what does it profit notion, I think, speaks to some of the bigger trends in society and in our history over the past couple of generations. We had the Keynesian period and the post-war years, and then that gave way to Milton Friedman and the kind of neoliberal movement. And it seems like you were working in banking at the kind of peak of some of the neoliberal ideology. And now I feel like we are sort of at a fork in the road, or an inflection point where we're not quite sure what is going to come next. We had the crash in 2008, and now of course with COVID, we're seeing the economy change in all sorts of ways. And people are thinking about what responsibilities do companies have to society at large. What role should the government play in all of this? And I realize this is a really big kind of existential question, but how are you thinking about this current moment we find ourselves in when it comes to capitalism and democracy, given both your career experience and also some of the work that you've done through your podcast?
I think even in my own personal experience, I've seen this very strong neoliberal dynamic where, everything, you need to have a market for everything. And I think that's destructive, particularly to, the concept of democracy, because when you think about what democracies are, you know, it's the rule of the people. When you look at a market, it's not the people ruling; it's individuals who have their own um, self-interest that's driving what's going on, which is very opposed to this concept of equality as being a first principle or sharing of some type of power structure within society. Clearly I see democracy as, the people deciding what to value as opposed to individuals kind of fighting it out on their own. So, this is a dynamic time. I'm very inspired, though, because part of what I do in addition to doing the podcast is that every spring I teach a class in a graduate program at Catholic University, and my class is applied financial management. So here I have, a group of maybe 40 students every spring who come in so energized by this dynamic that that they find themselves in this place and time where they've got to rebel against this neoliberalism because they see it as not sustainable. And so I've got this, captive audience of kids that want to change the world, and so that keeps me excited because I really don't think that this model of Milton Friedman. I mean, I think we're all kind of in agreement. I wouldn't say all because there are clearly voices against it, but for the most part, the tide is going in such a direction that you see the financial roundtable saying, that we recognize that the shareholder primacy model is being transcended to more of the stakeholder model. And so when you hear voices coming from it's like the bastion of the kings of capital saying those kinds of things, that things are changing. And so I'm very inspired by that. I kind of wish it had happened earlier in my career, but I'm glad to see it's coming about because it makes me hopeful for I've got children of my own, so hopefully they'll continue to do better and more in this area. So I'm bullish, to use a financial metaphor.
Sure. Yeah. So when organizations like the Business Roundtable talk about a stakeholder focus, or as opposed to shareholders and that type of dynamic, who do they have in mind when they mean stakeholders? I think there's one maybe cynical way to look at this. Only about half of the US population has access to the stock market in some form, whether through 401k or other types of programs. And so if that is the lens, that feels to me to be a little bit narrow, and I'm wondering kind of what that sense is among these kind of business leaders more broadly.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good question because it's important to imagine what that could mean. But in its purely, economic sense, you're talking about stakeholders being creditors, directors, employees, and then you broaden that out perhaps to governmental organizations, whether it's the where the company is headquartered or where they do business, but also its regulatory environment. And then you have, of course, shareholders or owners in the company, suppliers, in some cases, unions. And then I would say, there's this view that one of the important stakeholder groups is the communities in which the business draws its resources. And so that makes it very broad. And so some companies, I think of the likes of Patagonia as example. They have had a long, rich history in supporting the core values of their brand in terms of environmental sustainability, and that becomes who they are as a company, and it gives them some direction in terms of how they engage with all those kinds of stakeholders.
Yeah, and the other thing I think that complicates this issue, especially when it pertains to democracy and some of what you were saying about the will of the people, is that corporations are people too. You had an episode with Adam Winkler, a legal historian, that kind of went through this in fairly great detail. But for our listeners who might not have heard that episode yet, can you sort of give a quick synopsis of that argument, and then maybe how you think about corporations as people in this broader thesis that you're constructing for yourself and your listeners on your show?
Sure. I mean, I wish I could give justice to Adam Winkler's, all of Adam Winkler's arguments, and I would really highly recommend his book, We the Corporations. It is, I told Adam in our interview that it's one of my favorite books because for me, it is. What he does is he tells the story of what might be called the untold civil rights movement, which is the way that corporations gained their civil rights. And he takes us back, even to the founding narratives of our country. We think of the idea that folks came over seeking religious freedom and a new kind of paradigm and way of living. But he says, well, wait a minute, rewind. Think about the commercial side of that story, which happened much earlier. And he talks about the Virginia Company and and tells that story. But when you talk about the question of are corporations people, and that discussion with Adam, he told this story that goes back to the early 1880s, and he tells a story about Southern Pacific Railroad, and they were represented, I think, keenly by this character named Roscoe Conklin. And Roscoe had been a former senator and a close presidential advisor. He was the political rock star of his day. And he was hired by the Southern Pacific Railroad to make the argument that the 14th Amendment was, which gives the notation that no state shall deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or any person. And so this word person, within its jurisdiction, the equal protection of the laws. Well, he was arguing that because he was present at the creation or the writing of the 14th Amendment, that actually there was this debate whether the word person or citizen should be used. And he argued that, oh, no, it was meant to be broad. The concept of personhood was more appropriate than citizens, to incorporate, the idea that businesses could avail of this protection as well. The 14th Amendment was, rather than being adopted or just adopted to shield former slaves from discrimination, but it actually been transformed into, a weapon for corporations to use to strike down unwanted regulation. And, that was just the beginning of it. But that's really where, it all started. And so you think about like the 60s, yes, there were businesses who said, hey, in some of the same arguments that we see in LGBTQ space now, as an example, or with women, those same civil rights arguments were used, but turned down in the 1960s. So, perhaps the court will get there. We need some more cases. But, Adam will be the first to tell you that I asked him the question, is it just the political dimension of the court? And he said, well, looking back, the court has had, no matter the political affiliation, I don't know if he used the word bias, but a sense of support for business interests. And, he kind of suggested that perhaps it was just part of our country's culture.
Does all of that make it more difficult for the people like yourself who are trying to advance a different way of doing things because there's this other narrative out there? Is it like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of thing?
I was thinking more like spitting in the wind. If you look at financial resources as an instrument of power, yeah, you feel at some point kind of powerless because, I tend to take the view that, it's going to take some dramatic, and maybe it's a revolution. And no, I'm not calling for anarchy or anything like that. But we see these movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, and before that, the Me Too movement, and before that, the Occupy movement. When there is a tip of this tender balance that we have, where the oppressed, outnumber or lose their sense of patience with the oppressors. You guys are political scientists. That's what starts revolutions. And so I think actually that might be an interesting segue to tell you that in a couple of weeks, we're going to have an episode on our show with Morris Pearl, formerly of BlackRock, who founded an organization called Millionaires for Humanity, who makes that argument. He's like, well, wait a second, we're a bunch of wealthy people who realize that these vast measures of inequality make for unsafe communities and threaten democracy. And, that's bad for business. And so he talks about the importance of having this balance. And, that's how I see where we are.
Yeah, I mean the other argument that comes into all this goes something like, corporations are interested in making these changes, but only up to the point at which they don't have to give up anything to get them. If they can make tweaks around the margins, they maybe make themselves feel better. They could show, whether it's a PR thing or whether it is their shareholders or others that they're working with, hey, look at all this good work that they're doing. But really, if you kind of go one level deeper, not that much actually changes, and the same types of hierarchies and things are maintained. And so I guess I have two questions for you about that. One, are people on the other side, kind of, corporate leaders, folks within corporate America, aware of this critique? And if so, is it something, is it something that they give credence to, or, how seriously do they take it?
I look to the world for examples. I think yes, because if you don't look out for the financial interests of your company generally, it makes it very difficult to sustain an ongoing concern. So I think there's always that economic balance. But I look to the bravery of companies like Delta Airlines. I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida. Delta Airlines severed its relationship with the National Rifle Association. They had which is actually one of my banking clients. They had a loyalty program or an incentive program giving discounts for NRA members. When this shooting happened, the airline said, "Wait a second, we are going to eliminate that program because we want to." You know, given give a position that the airline wanted to take a neutral status on the national debate on gun control, and they felt that this affiliation with the NRA suggested that they were supportive of all of the NRA's activities. And that's one way to take a stand. But you know what happened when they did that? Delta's based in Georgia, and there were lawmakers in Georgia that had I think it was something like a $50 million fuel tax exemption for Delta. They voted it down, and some say in retaliation for the attack on quote unquote conservatives. And you know, that was a bold move that Delta took, but it was for what they thought was an important reason.
It's funny you bring up Delta to the point of what we were saying about two steps forward, one step back. I think Delta was also the airline that came under fire for doing stock buybacks with its bailout money that it received during COVID. So,
oh yeah,
I
don't
think
get me started.
I guess thinking about even this Delta example, I mean, if we're at a place where the governments, we certainly saw this in 2008, and we've seen it now more recently during COVID. It's taxpayer money that's going to bail out these corporations. Do you see, or do you think that the responsibilities that the corporations have should change at all if it is more of that kind of direct government funding as opposed to how they might have operated before that intervention?
If you ask me personally, I say yes. I was trying to go there with Adam Winkler in our episode on corporate civil rights. And I said, Adam, we're talking about all of these civil rights that these companies have, but what are their responsibilities? And he kind of laughed. And he's like, well, there aren't a whole lot of responsibilities for citizens or persons within the Constitution. He said he can't imagine them sitting on juries and so forth. But he said, that falls in the moral domain. And, he's absolutely right. I think that, if in fact consumers move corporate behavior, it's going to have to be a place where consumers just look at what goes on and say, look, enough is enough. You need to have some moral responsibility. And I see a lot of that pushback coming in the housing area, the post 2008 crash and so forth, saying, hey, you bailed out these big insurance companies and these banks, but what did you do on foreclosure assistance or debt forgiveness or whatever that would have that would take those public benefits that were given to those corporations and share it with a broader constituency, more at the personal level. So, I'm a student of contributive justice theory, and I really have a solid belief that not only do we have an obligation to contribute to the development of society, but we also have the right to be able to do so. And you think about all of the things that happen in public life that could inhibit a person's ability to develop to their fullest potential. And so when you think about things like access to healthcare, in my view, that's fundamental. If you look at access to safe communities and a decent place to live, that's fundamental. Access to education, that's fundamental, because if you don't have those things, how do you develop to your fullest, to be able to contribute to your fullest, to be able to, at its end, help others contribute? And so I think all of those things that help, in the common good, help aid in that process. So I don't subscribe to the idea that there's a magic formula or a silver bullet, but I do think it's a combination of ways of helping to support people to develop and to give them a sense that they owe it to all of us to contribute in their own ways. Whether it's something as simple as taking good care of your family and your family members, to supporting those in your community who might be marginalized or vulnerable. There are all kinds of ways, and it's as unique as every one of us. So I applaud the inventory of ideas, and I'm really hopeful that perhaps in this next administration we'll have a more sane and robust dialogue about these kinds of things.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that we saw in this election, Florida, as you may know, passed through a ballot initiative a $15 minimum wage proposal, and I think there's some of the pundits will say that this speaks to a broader economic populism that's out there, but that these policies that are kind of progressive in their nature really do have broad public support, but the influence of corporations and the donor class and all of these things get in the way of bringing these issues to the attention of elected officials because of dark money and some of these other factors. Do you see those dynamics changing at all as we look to the future, or do you have a sense of whether some of these arguments about these policies that really speak more to the common good, to the people who are not maybe directly involved with corporations, are those messages getting through at all to people inside corporate America? What's your sense on these types of more progressive policy ideas that are out there?
Well, I mean, if you were to ask me what I see as the truth or the crux of the matter, I think campaign finance is the gateway issue to absolutely everything in our democratic society, because it has such a ripple effect. And so when you talk about who makes the laws in our country? Well, you look at the complexion of our lawmakers, and they come from, by and large, and I think this is changing, and I think this hopefully bodes well for the future, but by and large, a particular class of individuals that are supported by and large from a particular section of society that has a lot of resources. And it takes in my view, a remarkable person to step back and say, what is in the common good? as opposed to what is in the my own personal interests. And, quite frankly, at some level, I don't blame politicians, because if they're not reelected, they can't do anything. So there's this, tension. But I think that if we were to look at meaningful ways to address campaign finance, things just might have an opportunity to change.
Well, Dawn, thank you for all of your work on your podcast. It was really great to get your take, and thanks for joining us today.
Well, as a former political science student, I have a graduate degree in political science. I feel like I've come home. So thank you for keeping me in the tribe, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,